I'll give you a brief introduction beyond what may be on the Think Like a Commoner book. I spent many years in Washington as an activist and working for a congressman and a regulatory agency. And then I fell in the mid 90s with a number of Europeans and others who were studying the commons as a different paradigm for politics, culture, and economics. And the more I got into it, the more I realized there was a lot more depth that hadn't been fully explored, even by some of the social scientists who had been studying it. So I've been involved with a rather eclectic and sprawling international network of activists, academics, project leaders, and sometimes government officials who are interested in the commons. And that's sort of where I come from on the topic. I want to start today by framing this conversation with the book that I wrote and published last fall called Free, Fair, and Alive, The Insurgent Power of the Commons, which I co-authored with my German colleague, Silke Helfrich. It's kind of it's about 6 years after I finished Think Like a Commoner. And if Think Like a Commoner is Commons 101, this is more Commons 303 or 404. And we tried to synthesize in a far more refined way and with a deeper understanding what we think the commons is all about. So my talk will reflect some of that. So let me start by getting the share screen going so I can go through my slides. This was released last October. There is a German version and a Spanish edition is coming out this week, as a matter of fact, and there's ones planned in Greek and French as well, which are underway. We came to realize that a lot of the conventional attitudes toward capitalism, toward so-called free markets, are simply not working anymore. And the 2008 financial crisis sort of brought this home, that some of the assumptions about how the world works according to standard economics are only partially operative and indeed don't really grasp a lot of the actual dimensions of the human condition. They focus on homo economicus, the supposedly self-interested, utility maximizing individual who finds satisfaction and happiness through market transactions. And we find that that's no longer really meeting needs so much. And similarly, the nation state, as it functions as liberal democracy, is also starting to have its problems and sometimes even fail. The rise of authoritarianism in many countries around the world is starting to suggest that some of those systems of governance are under extreme stress and maybe can't provide the answers. And I might add that, the basic conclusion that I've come to with my colleagues is that capitalist storylines are starting to fall apart and they're leaving a void in the market or in the political culture. We see the market and the state as really allied. They have different functions and different focuses, and sometimes they're cast as adversaries, but essentially they're devoted to the same storyline of economic growth, extreme individualism, consumerism, and progress through technological innovation. And while I'm not trying to say that those are necessarily bad things, well, growth has its limits. The problem is they're starting not to function very well, and they're starting to create serious ecological problems and inequality. So the issue that I've been dealing with much of my work is, can the commons help us imagine some new pathways for growing a new world? And that's what this is about. I sort of reject the dualism that pits capitalism versus socialism as the only discussion worth having. Both of those presume that the state is the only significant actor, or the market is the only significant actor, and that they're centralized processes run by governments or corporations, and that there are no other serious alternatives. It's one reason why the commons is really misunderstood, because it's presumed that only the state or the market have the resources or power or credibility or legitimacy to deal with our many problems that occur. But as a result, the commons has really been marginalized and even ignored. There's even been kind of an amnesia about the historic role that commons have played in human history, as if only the state and the market, the state only being roughly a form that's only 400 years old, and the market only being formalized over the past 150 or 200 years and gone on steroids in the past 30 or 40 years. They're historical phenomena that are not necessarily universal and forever. And I think the commons is starting to reassert itself as a different mode of governance that is both very new and very old. But to go to the more recent history, the tragedy of the commons, which is described in Think Like a Commoner, is got its, well, it goes back a century or two, but it got a repopularization, you might say, in 1968, when the biologist Garrett Hardin wrote his essay, The Tragedy of the Commons. And as you may recall, he said that imagine you have a pasture in which everybody can put as many cattle on it as they want. Nobody will have a rational incentive to hold back, and people will collectively overexploit and ruin the commons, and resulting in the so-called tragedy. And this has been a dominant parable and metaphor for the commons for the past 50 years. And the problem is he wasn't really describing a commons. He was describing a free-for-all or an open access regime in which there was no community, no rules, no enforcement of the rules, no ways to limit the use of the resource. So unfortunately, he wasn't really describing the commons. Moreover, he was describing the physical resource that was shared and not the social system as such, which I think is another fallacy. The common scholar Lewis Hyde has said it's really the tragedy of unmanaged, laissez-faire common pool resources with easy access for non-communicating, self-interested individuals. There's a lot of embedded assumptions in the whole story, which he doesn't fully explicate. And in our world of market individualism and libertarianism, there are certain presumptions that we're all isolated individuals, that we all are self-interested materialists, and that the market is the way we fulfill all of that. And I'd like to problematize that, as they say, to suggest that it's really not the only story here. And it was Eleanor Ostrom, who, the political scientist from Indiana University, who really helped popularize this within scholarship. She spent 30, 40, 50 years of her life doing extensive field research in poorer rural countries, showing that farmland, fisheries, forests, irrigation water, wild game can and are often shared in common and managed sustainably without a so-called tragedy of the commons. So it was rather heroic field work and creative theorizing that she did. She won the Nobel Prize for her work in 2009, the first woman to win the Nobel Economics Prize. And I think it's also interesting that she won in 2009, the year after the 2008 financial crisis, when they were looking for a little kinder, more humane economist to win the prize. Because in truth, most economists had not heard of her, because most economists don't regard cooperation and long-term relationships as being that economically consequential. That's what her work proved. To this day, she has not really been embraced by the economics profession, precisely because I think she calls into question some of the premises of the standard economic narrative. And it's important to know, or to realize, that the commons is not just a resource the way economists often refer to it and politicians refer to it. It's a self-organized social system that consists of the community, the resource, and the social norms and practices and protocols and traditions and rituals by which that resource is managed. So it's more than just sort of simple sharing and cooperation. It becomes an elaborate system and culture by which resources are managed for all without, or managed for the participants at least, without market or state being involved. Now, I have to have a brief detour into enclosures, which I covered somewhat in Think Like a Commoner, because enclosures is a language that market economics doesn't really talk about, because market economics presumes that the common good is fulfilled through market exchange, the so-called invisible hand. But the commons discourse brings that into question by talking about enclosures and showing how the, well, I was going to, oops, I don't know how to go back. Oh, here we go. By showing how the commodification and privatization of resources, which the market routinely does, at least capital-driven markets, how that can be quite pernicious and dispossess people. The basic issue is that global capital wants free and subsidized resources, and it doesn't want the resistance from commoners who are trying to often hold on to their traditional commons the way indigenous people often do, the way traditional communities in Africa, Latin America, Asia often do, and even domestically too. And the state often runs political interference, you might say, by making it more possible for global capital to enclose the commons. And we see this right now with what could be called the great international land grab, where you have hedge funds and sovereign investment funds, places like countries like China, essentially going to Africa, colluding with the government to buy title to the land. And often the communities that have lived on the land for generations don't have a legal title. And the government says, well, then you don't own it. And basically is trying to convert the land into a market asset or to sell it off to these companies. Now, this is just countries and companies. And this is just replicating the English enclosure movement of the 1800s, when the same thing happened in England. People were forced to become wage slaves and move to the cities to become wage earners, as chronicled by Charles Dickens. So this is happening right now in many countries of the global South. And it's really going to be a setup for a lot of inequality and famines in the coming years. Another enclosure going on is the human genome. Roughly 25% of it is now patented privately, mostly owned by companies. And this often has consequences by preventing scientists from studying, for example, the breast cancer susceptibility gene, which is privately owned. And because there's a danger that you might be infringing on someone else's patent to their commercial detriment. And there was a famous case that went to the Supreme Court about the breast cancer susceptibility gene. There was a partial rollback of that patent to allow more access to the gene, but it's an example of how enclosure can have these really dangerous influences. A lot of the Disney, early Disney films and glitter, well, they had comic books and other things, were based on folk stories that they copyrighted and trademarked to basically annex Snow White, Pinocchio, and many fairy tales, which were really public domain stories that they enclosed and made private property, started to build their empire on a lot of that. This goes on today with a lot of folk stories and things that are in the public domain, which are privatized for market purposes. One of my favorites was how in the 1980s, ASCAP, a music licensing body, which licenses music for public performances, said that the Girl Scouts couldn't sing around the campfire and charge money for their summer camps because that was a public performance that required a copyright license. Just an example of how private property rights and corporate control over culture and everyday life is going to new extremes. And there's many other market enclosures we could talk about. It's really, I think, a pervasive phenomena these days. And I think it's one reason the language of the commons has been adopted to try to articulate and save the non-market alternatives. So let me talk now about more proactively about some of the commons that are out there, which are what people don't appreciate, that commons are very value creating and generative themselves. If you look at the standard economic textbook, you won't know that about 2 billion people around the world feed their households through commons. This is called subsistence and often denigrated as, brutal poverty, and sometimes it is, but there's plenty of households out there that meet their needs quite happily through various natural resources as commons, which are in many cases far more stable and ecologically benign than volatile global markets, which are often more expensive and proprietary. And this is happening in the global north as well, where we see things like agroecology and permaculture becoming more popular. There's things like community supported agriculture, which is fairly well established in Europe and the US. There's the whole slow food movement, trying to bring food back to its regions and have it enjoyed, as opposed to food just a rank commodity like fast food that is stripped of any meaning or social history that it historically has had. And there's many other types of relocalization of food that's going on. There's a whole movement going on right now to create cities as a commons. And this is the reaction to global capital and investors starting to hollow out cities the way Airbnb is converting rental housing in entire neighborhoods into tourist housing and evicting the people that once lived there or making it unaffordable for them. So there's efforts to create, for example, urban land trusts for more affordable housing and community gardens for more green space and quality vegetables. There's the idea of creating data commons that the city itself controls so that it's not simply privatized by investors for private gain the way Google and Twitter and Facebook do. Guifinet in Barcelona is this massive regional Wi-Fi system that is run as a commons, and it provides far better broadband service at lower price than we appreciate here in the US. And there's even a city in Austria that has created a whole set of information resources they call Open Commons links, from web pages and servers to email to government information that's readily available to people on a far more accessible basis than you find here, where in many states, they actually try to copyright the state statutes. So you have to pay a private vendor to get state law. It's being challenged, but it gives you an example of the different culture going on. Alternative currencies are flourishing in many areas. They're an attempt to, the reason they're valuable is they can recirculate community value. Instead of the money being siphoned away by the banks or companies, so that a region simply becomes you might say a location for neo-colonial extraction of value. Local currencies allow that money to stay rooted in the same area. And has a lot of potential, I think, for developing place-based economies again, instead of having anonymous places everywhere. The web is often regarded as the place for all these major corporations, and it is, but it's not appreciated that it's also a hosting infrastructure for commons, where for a relatively low amount of money and modest technical skills, one can create an infrastructure for commons for people to come together to share photos, to share music, to share content, to have archives, to share scholarly and scientific information. So this is an aspect of the web and the internet that's not really appreciated as much. A lot of it has been facilitated by Creative Commons licenses that authorize legal sharing, which, most anything you create is born copyrighted as private property. And so they had a group called Creative Commons invented these licenses on copyright, which allow you to signal in advance that that anyone can share and copy and reuse and modify something you create. And it's like an advance authorization to share something. And this has this has been replicated around the world, but it's also created a vast quantities of music, film, video, photos, scholarly literature, etc., that is legally shareable, which used to be very difficult or problematic. So it opened the floodgates for a lot of sharing that we take for granted. This followed on the heels of the open source software revolution, where that penguin is the logo for Linux, which is a famous open source operating system, which can be shared and modified by anyone if you have the technical skills. And this is important because at a time when things like Microsoft Windows was the dominant monopoly, it was difficult for people to modify their software and to make it more meet their needs more, customize it to meet their needs. And open source is actually pervasive around the internet. That feather is a sign of the Apache software, which is an important part of the internet. LibreOffice is a free and open source word processing program. The new logo on the bottom right is a logo for the Free Software Foundation, which is the leading advocate for this kind of software. And the green circle is the logo for open access scholarly publishing, which is a very important kind of literature that if you're a scholar, you often find that articles are behind paywalls, and maybe your university doesn't subscribe and pay a huge subscription fee that they charge. Open access makes scholarly and scientific literature far more accessible to people. And there's other offshoots of this, like the Open Textbook Network, which allows textbooks to be shared and printed on demand at cost, which is often very important for, say, community college students who often have trouble meeting the bills of going to college. So those are all extremely important developments. And there's even now a new generation of what is often called cosmo-local production, where the design and knowledge is shared globally, but you produce physical things locally. So FarmHack is a whole set of designs for agricultural equipment. And there's a WikiSpeed, another car, which the designs can be replicated locally for producing locally. Arduino is the trademark for electronic circuit boards and other electronic equipment, which you can buy under the brand name Arduino, but the designs themselves are entirely open and shareable. Another example of how this alternative business model is going. And Fab Labs, which there are hundreds of these around the world, are often incubators for these new kinds of ideas through Commons. And I guess the bottom line point here is that Commons can arise anywhere. In Boston, there's something called the HowlRound Theater Commons, which is a collection of non-commercial and nonprofit theater people, performers, playwrights, and others. And it's a great place for them to preserve their identity and develop themselves without considering themselves junior Broadway. They're non-commercial theater. There's a humanitarian OpenStreetMap team that, when there's a natural disaster, produces digital maps so that first responders can respond more effectively. There's these potatoes in Peru, among these indigenous people, the Quicha. They have control over what's called an agro-ethnobotanical landscape, because there are literally hundreds of different species of potatoes that they have become the official stewards of, so that a lot of first world ag biotech companies can't simply come and steal the genetic knowledge and patent it the way they had been doing and still continue to do in many places. And then I mentioned GuiFiNet. The open source seed initiative is an attempt to keep seeds shareable, because many biotech companies are trying to make them entirely proprietary or sterile so that you can't replant the seeds after the end of the season. Another front in this whole fight against enclosures. So the question I think I confronted after many years of looking at the Commons, and indeed after writing the book Think Like a Commoner, was how can we learn to see and understand the Commons on their own terms? And that's what my challenge was in writing the book Free, Fair, and Alive with Silke. We realized that they were not simply a subset of standard economics, but they had a different pattern of life in them. And we realized that some of the, let me just tell this story about how we came to this realization. I live in Amherst, Massachusetts, and we went to the Amherst College Geological Museum, where they have a great collection of dinosaur tracks, as you can see on the right. And in the 1840s, the president of Amherst College, who was a geologist, was trying to understand what were these tracks. And he theorized that they were giant turkeys, flying turkeys. And this was before the word dinosaur had even been invented. It was before Darwin had published The Origin of the Species. And this fellow, who, despite being a very smart, learned fellow in touch internationally, was raised in the Bible and the whole story of creation. And he couldn't imagine deep time, and he hadn't seen other dinosaur tracks from other parts of the world, and Robert Owen and other geologists hadn't invented the word. The point is, they could not conceptualize a world beyond their worldview. They couldn't interpret the data in a different way. And that's sort of our proposition about the commons, is that it is still seen through what I would call the archaic perspective of market capitalism, where value is seen as price and progress is all about commodifying and privatizing something. And free trade, which is supposed to maximize value, is often just extraction and dispossession of people, of countries. So the commons really proposes a shift of worldview and a perceptual lens of how you see the world. And you can see the world as a forest as a set of barcodes of something to be sold as a commodity, or you can see the forest as something embedded in an ecosystem that is deeply interdependent and complex, and not simply a price. So Silke and I came to realize that commoning is generative and value creating and far from a tragedy. And it represents a different worldview, a different ethos, a different operational logic for how we relate to so-called resources. We had problems with the word resources because it had some built-in presumptions that it's separate from us, and you can simply sell it, it's inert, it's not alive. Whereas the commons is more alive, you have a relationship to it. So we invented the word care wealth as really kind of a term that may refer to the same physical thing, but it denotes a different relationship that you might have to it. So the commons is really about bottom-up practical experimentation, what works to manage something sustainably. It's not really about ideology, because it's very situationalist based, very place-based. And it's more a verb than a noun. There is no commons without commoning, as the historian Peter Linebaugh has said. And so once you start to see that it's a social activity as opposed to a thing as such, it opens up a different perspective for how we think and talk about the commons. And it really asserts a different universe of values, because when you have a bounded community of commoners trying to manage some shared wealth, it's important to talk about fairness, and it's important to talk about the responsibilities everyone has, as well as the entitlements you get for it. It's about long-term stewardship to preserve the well-being of the shared wealth. And it's about meeting basic needs first, and not just trying to maximize the sales of it, the throughput, as some economists put it. And a very important concept is inalienability and decommodification. Something is inalienable when it can't be sold to the market, when it's considered too valuable, too precious, or inappropriate to sell something to the market. We don't sell babies. It's considered morally wrong to sell sex or to sell dead human bodies. So there's certain moral, ethical issues that come into play about what should be for sale on the market. And then conversely, some things that are currently in the market, the commons attempts to decommodify them the way community land trusts take land off the market and hold it in trust in perpetuity instead of making it for sale. And I guess two other things. The commons is about people themselves making rules from the bottom up, not rules from on top from the state or some authority issuing them. So the rules are crafted to meet local purposes and needs. And this gets embodied in custom and tradition. And that's kind of as a ethical and social gyroscope that keeps the stability of the commons, because for years, for decades, this is the way we do it, because that's the way we manage it sustainably. So commoning means learning to see relationality as the primary reality, as opposed to individual and objects being separate. And we see value as a living phenomena and not just something that's embedded on a balance sheet or in money. So this is the shift that I think really needs to happen and requires letting go of some old concepts and words. And I mentioned resources, for example, and development, which is seen as market growth. Well, market growth is sometimes devolutionary and degenerating value. And in a commons, you don't necessarily have leaders, you more have, which implies followers, you more have expertise that's broadly shared, and so on. So not only do you have to let go of some of these old words we thought we realized, but you have to learn a new vocabulary. I mentioned care wealth. We use the word nested I because the presumption is not the way Americans tend to think, that we are just isolated individuals who have full autonomy. The nested I realizes that we're embedded intergenerationally and with different sets of communities and with nature itself, so that our very sense of identity and self is nested within these other collectives. And so it's not simply a communism, for example, where you just drift off into this collective identity, because individuality is retained, but it just manifests within this larger web of connections. I won't go through all of these, but I'll just give you an idea of the direction we go in inventing this vocabulary. Economic rationality considers it rational to maximize your individual return in material terms as much as possible, no matter what the consequences for other people or the environment. We talk about Ubuntu rationality. Ubuntu is a South African term from the Bantu that means I am because we are, meaning the collective well-being is connected to my personal well-being, and those have to be in balance and aligned. So these are the kinds of shifts of perspective and orientation that the commons, I think, requires, and that our book Free, Fair, and Alive goes through in greater detail than Think Like a Commoner. But the seeds of that were with me 6 years ago when I wrote that book. This is a video that I don't have embedded here, so I can't play it, but that's Silke, my co-author, where we had a brainstorming session to come up with a word for knowledge that can be shared among commoners, because there's a difference between openness and a commons. Something that's open can be taken by anyone, and a lot of people like Google or major corporations then make it part of their market services and arsenal. And a commons retains certain control over it so that it simply cannot be appropriated. So there's a difference between open, even though open is a big advance over the previous industrial proprietary culture. Open is different from commons, which has a stewardship and control over the resource, as opposed to it simply being available for anyone to take. And I would just, I think, end this little segment by saying that the inner life matters as well. This is a map of the Great Sandy Desert, and it's the standard way that we Western moderns look at it. But I find it so interesting that this is how the indigenous people, the Aborigines there, look at it. This is their map of the same region. And you can see it's almost a work of art, or it is a work of art. And it's because they have deep emotional and cultural and spiritual relationship to the land that map, the other map, doesn't. This map presumes that we're separate from it and it can be objectified. This map shows that we have a deeper inner relationship with the external land. So really the commons, I think, is about world making. It's about creating these worlds that our subjective lives, our spiritual lives, our ethical lives are implicated in. And it creates a politics of belonging, which arguably the nation state has trouble doing, and certainly markets do. It is able to assert an economics of sufficiency, meaning we don't have to have constant, relentless consumption and growth. We can have a sense of sufficiency to meet our needs. And it's a culture that decommodifies things and shares, because those kinds of relationships are deeper and more meaningful than simply one-off market transactions. I would hasten to say this is not a strict either or situation. It's a matter of degree, but it's very helpful to see that there is this other type of human relationship besides that of the market. So we approach this as understanding the commons as social patterns. And by that, we took inspiration from Christopher Alexander, who was this dissident urban planner and architect and philosopher, who wondered why certain design patterns in architecture and urban design were so recurrent. Why did they, over centuries and across cultures, why do we have certain proportions and squares and windows and dimensions? And he developed the idea of a pattern language, meaning there are certain recurrent social solutions to recurrent social problems. And they're solved in different ways depending upon the context. So they're not identical, but they are clusters of patterns. And we found this useful for describing commons, because commons always bear the imprint of their context, their geography, their culture, their history, their language, and so forth. And patterns allow us to assert certain regularities that occur without saying it's always like this in a universal way. It is able to acknowledge the diversity that is within commons while also recognizing the regularities. So Silke and I developed this idea of three, well, we call it the triad of commoning, that it's a social phenomena in which there's provisioning and peer governance, and they're all related, but these are three different distinct realms. And for each one of them, there are different patterns that we see. And Silke and I based this on our experiences with scores of different commons, which we came to realize that the framework that is used by Elinor Ostrom and many economists was presuming the rational actor individual as opposed to the socially coherent collective. And these are, I won't go through all these patterns, but I just wanted to show that this is how we help to understand the commons in a new way as a social phenomena that reaches into our inner lives, as opposed to presuming that's a black box, the way economics doesn't care to look into it. So these are some of the patterns. I'll just let you look at them for a bit, just so you can see some of the things that it's not as if all commons have these patterns, but we found them in many, many instances that these were the ones that define them, that make them work well. And finally, provisioning. So there's these patterns play out in different ways, and we illustrate them with different examples, and they helped us understand in a more cross-sectoral way how commons function, as opposed to presuming that commons are resource-based alone. I mean, some resources get used up and are finite and therefore have to be managed in different ways than resources like software, code, or information, which can be reproduced for next to nothing at no cost. That said, there are certain cross-sectoral, cross-cutting social patterns that tend to exist when a commons works. And we see this at the micro level, but then there's a meso level of sort of infrastructure where this happens, where you have larger structures that are facilitating how a commons works. And then at a macro level, where the state is usually hostile to commons because it sees the market as a more productive ally, and one that they can get tax revenue from as well. Whereas a commons is seen as, well, how does it help the power of the state? It doesn't necessarily see it. And so the state is more often likely to enter into a partnership with corporations and markets because it sees it as a more powerful ally. And people say, well, how can the commons grow if there's state power and you have this alliance between the market and the state? And I take some consolation from the philosopher Hannah Arendt, who said that power springs up between people when they act together and vanishes the moment they disperse. In other words, when people come together in commons, they're creating a kind of political power through their association and their collaboration. And the legitimacy and trust that it creates. So commons really are kind of proto-political associations that operate outside or inframed by state power. And there's a tension between state power and commons. People often ask me, how do you scale the commons and make them bigger? How do you build the commons verse? I think the basic answer, which is unsatisfactory because it's more complex, that you emulate and federate so that it's at the appropriate scale, but through federating, often through internet connections and other collaborations, you can create a larger footprint of influence and collaboration, the way we've seen with open source software and open access scholarly publishing and many others, which are transnational phenomena of great scope, but they have more rooted place-based collaboration as well. And there's infrastructure for commoning, and there's commons public partnerships. We could get into that. Those are kind of more of the frontier of the commons world today. But I think the basic pattern is the next big thing will be a lot of small things, meaning the global capitalism has huge infrastructure costs and transportation costs and coordination costs and legal costs to maintain itself. And it's starting to implode those costs. It's starting to become more ecologically costly too, which is why there's a lot of drive for relocalization and regionalization. And my conviction is that the next big thing will be the coordination of a lot of more appropriately scaled systems of meeting needs, and not just the world as one totally integrated marketplace. That's not going to go away, to be sure, but I think the cost of trying to fulfill the capitalist utopian vision of a totally integrated global marketplace with everything marketized is just falling apart, and we're seeing that right now. It's a great question, and I think that maybe the credibility of that dream of, if only I can get on the capitalist ladder and start climbing it, I'm going to become the millionaire too. I think we're starting to see how that's not just kind of a fraud, it's biophysically impossible. And I think that that's becoming more clear, especially as the vice of capitalism tightens and the opportunities are reducing, are not as much there, and the cost of being a what shall I say, top to bottom, wall to wall participant in market culture becomes greater. And I think that we saw, for example, in the pandemic, how self-organized mutual aid societies were spontaneously formed and more effective than many bureaucracies and standing institutions. And I think that people are starting to discover that these self-organized systems are both more effective, but more satisfying. And that's one reason open source software became so popular, because of the limitations of proprietary software, the click-through licenses and the shrink wrap licenses, which said you can do this, you can't do that. And similarly with farmers who find that they can't replant their seeds and they have to pay ever higher prices for seeds each year because it's a proprietary seed. So the costs of the enclosure, the human what shall I say, degradation or lack of meeting needs that enclosures are creating are provoking a lot of people to create commons as a more satisfactory way of meeting their needs, or sometimes simply for survival. The commons is often a vehicle for survival. So this is a historical process, but I think that in terms of people changing their mind, it's becoming a participant in the commons and then starting to interpret their experiences through the language and lens of the commons, because you can't simply make moral exhortations about this because people won't get it. They won't have the reference points. They need to become a participant and say, oh, this describes my experience or my aspirations. So that's how I'd answer that. Well, I mean, I mentioned the hostility or indifference of the state to commons, and indeed the prejudice of law against commons, because the law is designed to facilitate capitalism and private property, and collective interests are not well protected or represented by law generally. Having said all that, there's places like Barcelona and Amsterdam, big global cities, that are actively and creatively experimenting with how their government can work with commons in a neighborhood or citywide sense, as opposed to them being simply bureaucratic providers and controllers. Now, I don't want to make it be too optimistic but I guess the state is starting to realize that it's having trouble meeting needs solely through the market economy or money, and that a lot of people's problems don't have to do with money. They have to do with feeling cared for and having social relationships, not being alienated and feeling belonging. And those need to be nurtured somehow, or we're going to have the kind of authoritarian alternative that's arising instead, which is one of the few other ways to have that belonging. So, it's an open question how state power in its many different guises, state power is different in many different regions because of the histories and relationships with the state, how that's going to adapt. But my purpose in a lot of my work is to try to encourage people to self-identify as commoners and see it as a way to petition their government with a different vision than traditional political parties are providing, and to sort of reframe how they engage. So it's, unclear how that will evolve, if it will be effective, but that's the essence of being an activist, I guess. Well, commons, when you say better, that becomes the critical term of better for whom and who says it's better. If you talk to any committed market capitalist, they think that the best good is achieved through market exchange. And indeed, if you destroy commons, if you enclose them, if you marketize them and exchange them in markets, the invisible hand is producing the better good. So there's a contested definition of what's better. And I happen to think that a lot of market enclosures are increasingly inhumane and alienating and a force for dispossession. They're a way for power to become concentrated, and they put all relationships as one-off transactional ones instead of longer-term stewardship or mutual commitment. So there's kind of a social premise built into the idea of market exchange as the template for how we should order ourselves. So is there a way to prevent it? Yes. And that's sort of the big creative challenge of the commons world, is to devise laws or social norms or technological fixes that prevent the commodification and appropriation of shared wealth. And an example is like the Creative Commons licenses, where it was like a legal hack on copyright law, where instead of it being born private and controlled private, it was able to make it born shareable and protectable under the law. And so that was a legal hack to protect the shareability of cultural content, creative content. And the same with the general public license for free software. It said, you can use this software code for free that I created as the copyright holder, but you can only use it if you share it in the same way and make it modifiable and changeable. So these are ways in which a certain commons of code or creative content has been achieved. I think it's one of the big challenges we face in trying to devise other systems to protect commons, because enclosure is more the norm. Well, there's a certain arrogance in that presumes that our advanced technological age has its act together. And I think that we've seen that we often don't know what we're doing, and we're radically disconnected from ecological systems and their stability and sustainability. And in fact, commons really have an ancient history. If you talk to evolutionary scientists, they say that cooperation has been the hallmark of our species, and that we see how, in some ways, indigenous peoples and their cultures are arguably more advanced than ours, we moderns today, in the sense that they have more stable, happier, sustainable relationships with each other and the land than we've managed to do as modern private property owners and market exchangers. So I think we need to appreciate that and appreciate that a lot of the ancient practices of living with the earth as co-creators is what we need to learn from moving forward. So yeah, I think normal people are entirely capable of this. And in fact, it's kind of spontaneous and even hardwired. It's just been repressed or not rewarded in contemporary society. So that's why the global South, global North dialogues, I think, could be so constructive. Well, I see ideology as a more systematized political approach that's oriented towards the state policy and law and how the state should function. And therefore it has this abstract, rigid quality, whereas commoning is more practical. How do we make this work on the ground? And it doesn't take account of, it doesn't say, are you a Republican or a Democrat and this is better or worse? It's like, does it work? And the transition town movement, if you're familiar with that, is very oriented towards that. They don't care, where in the political the conventional political spectrum you are. It's like, can you help us devise a local self-sufficiency for water or for forest management? And how do we make this work? So that's the difference, I think, is that commoning is more focused on the practical issue at hand, which is embedded in a very specific local context and not as one size fits all as ideology tends to be. Well, I think that you start with instead of presuming the certain institutional traditions or norms, you start with what does a certain self-selected body of people want to learn. And there's a lot of co-learning experiments out there, which I take a lot of inspiration from the social critic Ivan Illich, who wrote a book called Deschooling Society, and was trying to foster a sense of education more as self-directed learning in cohorts than as a process for getting a credential that may or may not speak to the individual. Having said that, there's obviously an important role for people who have deeper experience and knowledge It's more about how everybody interacts and how the learning gets structured and crafted to meet their interests and needs as individuals. So, I could refer you to a chapter in the anthology, Patterns of Commoning, which is a collection of essays about different types of commons. There's an essay on a variety of co-learning projects and experiments, which might give some guidance or examples for that. I think it's more trying to be flexible in how students can teach the teacher and the teacher can teach the students. And it's a collectively negotiated process. So I think that's the vision for how education can work as a commons. I think that the two can coexist and play nicely, but part of the problem is there's a difference between markets and capital-driven markets, because capital uses markets as a vehicle for private accumulation of more capital and then further acquisition and greater concentration of power. Whereas, for example, place-based markets in a locality are more accountable to a community and are more less extractive and more respectful of people, because the people who maybe are selling in those local or regional markets know that they can't simply be as antisocial or anti-ecological. There'll be consequences. So I think that there's all sorts of smaller scale market exchange that is entirely benign and even helpful. It's more when it becomes capital-driven extraction, and then oblivious or not concerned with the so-called market externalities that are created. That's when it becomes harmful. So having said that, markets do tend to have a more impersonal, individualistic social ethic to them, which is, that's often what we want, what we need. But I think in this time in history and life, I think we're very needful of stable, connected social communities. And commons are one vehicle for nourishing that kind of social order. This is an uncertain how commons will grow and scale over time. Scale tends to imply centralized hierarchical systems. I see commons as trying to create their own networking system that allows them to retain the integrity of their smaller scale and interpersonal accountability without simply being rolled up into a concentrated, centralized power, which has its own dangers. Well, you would have something like happened with Sherlock Holmes when those novels went into the public domain, and there were different movies with different versions of it. And instead of A. Conan Doyle or his estate being able to control the character exclusively, it became more of a folk, accessible folk character, just the way fairy tales and folklore allowed the same stories to be retold and modified and to evolve and morph in different ways instead of having a single owner of it. So, maybe there's a value judgment that goes into that. I only want Disney to tell the story. But other people will say, the diversity of storytelling should belong to us all. So, the two is, again, I don't think it's fully an either or situation, but there are costs for Disney being the chief or primary guardian of all these folk tales that used to be accessible to us all. I think that it's illustrating our cultural polarization on this, because there's been lots of examples of people thinking like commoners in response to COVID, like the mutual aid efforts I mentioned earlier. There's a vast international network of mutual aid responses that are quite flourishing. COVID has also shown that we are not separate from nature, that we're biological creatures who are integrated with nature. And that's, I think, an important lesson of COVID that we still haven't fully absorbed, if you can see the way people are trying to deny that the virus is, that we individuals are biological, and that we have to find our peace and harmony with the virus, or prevent the destruction of habitats and landscapes, which many people think caused the COVID in the first place. And I might add, there's another place for the comment here is on the vaccines that are created. You know, when the polio vaccine was created in the late 50s, Jonas Salk, the creator of it with the team, said, he was asked, well, are you going to patent it? And he said, no, could you patent the sun? It belongs to humankind. And he was, of course, in this era when that was the ethical response. Nowadays, the vaccines are likely to be privately owned, often with government support for the research that went into those vaccines. Yet that's going to simply make it even more costly and less affordable to many people. The vaccine should be treated as a common asset that we all own, and we should treat it that way instead of as a private proprietary thing.